Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to all of you for joining us this day, Thursday, May 28, 2026, for what promises to be a very engaging, insightful discussion. And today, the ACCPA, the Africa-China Center for Policy and Advisory, together with our partner, the Canadian Center for African Affairs and Policy Research, we are very much privileged to get opportunity to come your way with this very important policy dialogue that sits more like a triangular in a way from Africa, China, and Canada. These are, of course, all huge mentions, and we believe there's a lot that can be discussed within the scope of these three keywords that I mentioned. But we'll try our best that within the next 60 or so minutes, we get to leave here with something concrete that we believe will go a long way, of course, looking at the fact that we are more focused on policy shaping. This discussion might find its way in the policy spaces, in the policy rooms, and we believe that will be a good measure of impact for both organizations, right? So just how the whole discussion will flow, of course, I'll give a background to who we are as ACCPA. I'll tell briefly about what the CCAAPR are, and then I will give a bit of intro to the topic that we are going to discuss today. I will then welcome our key presenters, our key panelists, to give their opening remarks for about 10, 15 or so minutes, depending on how the person wants to go about it, whether it's PPT presentation or not. And then we will zoom into the Q&A session. So I would love to hear from all of you. And to do that, to get involved in the conversation, I will encourage you to use the Q&A option for the Zoom. So that is where you can type in your question. There's a Q&A button on your Zoom app. You put in your questions, and this could be as you hear our speakers give their remarks. The questions could come up, and then I'll be happy to moderate that session and read out the questions to our key speakers. Of course, as and when it becomes necessary, of course, I also allow the opportunity to also give my comment on some of those questions. So we'll begin, and so that we can keep within the time. So briefly, for those of you that are joining us for the first time, for the ACCPA, the Africa-China Center for Policy and Advisory, so we're a policy research think tank. We're headquartered in Accra, Ghana. We have teams across multiple countries on the continent, as well as in China, and recently in the Netherlands as well. So what we are doing is it's serving as an African agency involved in how the continent, involved in shaping policy regarding how the continent is engaging with China, as well as other international partners, right? So what we do involve a typical think tank work, research, reports, policy briefs, short pieces of papers, articles, convenings. Convenings like, whether it's in person or virtual like we're doing here today. So those are some of the things that we've been doing. Of course, we've done quite a good number of work across multiple themes. Last year, for example, we did a huge work. Most of our work was on green finance and green industrialization, respect to Africa-China relations, together with our partners here on the continent and also as well. And so for us, it's always a privilege to be involved in anything that puts big questions on the table about Africa's development, trajectory in terms of engagement with international partners. Of course, we have zero-in focus on China, but as well as any other partner that we believe is of key interest, and of course, Canada being one of them, the GCC, Europe, America, the West in general, right? So for us, that's what we've been doing over the last couple of years. And our partner, the Canadian Center for African Affairs and Policy Research, is also Canada's foremost institution on African affairs, shaping the intellectual and strategic foundations of Canada's relationship with one of the most consequential regions of the 21st century, which is, of course, Africa. At the moment, defined by geopolitical realignment and economic transformation. The CCAAPR positions itself as a credible, informed, and strategically engaged actor within Africa's global assembly. And of course, you're based in Canada, and of course, headed by Templar, my good friend. So in due time, we might hear from Templar, of course, maybe through the chats, maybe we'll hear from him. But we are very excited to begin our first collaborative project, which is this very important virtual dialogue, theme, the Africa-China Canada Policy Dialogue. And what we are trying to do is that from time to time, we'll assemble key experts from all sides, from Africa, from China, from Canada, to look into some of the big questions, as I said earlier. Look at multiple themes, some recurring themes, some new themes that comes up that we believe requires a deeper, interrogation. That is where we step in to put together such a platform. And whilst this is the first of its kind and we're doing virtual, we are hoping that this will transition even into in-person sessions across the three regions, Africa, Canada, and China. And so we are hoping that as we begin this platform, we'll be able to bring on board more partners. So we are open to other partnership opportunities. So if you're on this dialogue and you feel what you're currently doing or what your visions are aligns with what we're trying to do, please feel free to reach out to us, and we'll be more than happy to engage and see where we can collaborate and find mutual opportunities. I will drop my email in the Q&A as well as the chat box to everyone. So in case you would like to reach out, of course, you feel free to do that. So that's the first part done, introducing both ACCPA and CCAAPR, our partners from Canada. Now, ladies and gentlemen, we'll be zooming in into our discussion, of course. Let me just check on what I've put together here. So in our first, policy dialogue, the Africa-China-Canada policy dialogue, we are discussing the theme, Canada's Africa strategy in an era of China expanding influence, right? And the word influence is used advisedly. We know how we want to create the conversation, right? Of course, we know that this conversation is very timely because as we know, there are a lot of changes happening around our world. Becoming multipolar, countries are reassessing their partnerships, interest, alignment, realignment, and of course, positioning. And of course, in this context, we can all see that Africa is not, just merely as a space of external engagement, but as an increasingly important actor. And I think that's even what is reflected in the profile of CCAAPR, as I mentioned earlier. So at the same time, we understand that, of course, China is expanding footprint across Africa. We know, how China's presence is involved in most discussion around the world, trade, development, infrastructure, and of course, international cooperation arena. And so these are raising important questions, even for countries like Canada and their engagement with the African continent, vis-a-vis Africa's engagement with Canada as well. So our objective today is not to frame the discussion in more like a binary, simplistic binaries, but rather to promote a balanced and forward-looking evidence-based conversation that places agency in terms of Africa's agency, more so Canada's agency, as well as Chinese agency, and interest at the center of the discussion. So just to give a background of what we're trying to do here today. And so to help us do this, I'm very much privileged. We are very much excited to be have the chance to engage two great professional, distinguished individuals in their own rights. And of course, I'll have the privilege to introduce them by reading out their brief profile so that we know who they are, what they've been up to, and so we can have an idea what expectation will be from them. And so even that in your Q&A, you can be very specific. You can know who you want to, you can mention who you want to direct your question to, and of course, we'll do that as well. Or you can just drop in any general question that comes to mind, as long as it aligns with the discussion that we are having here today. So, ladies and gentlemen, to introduce our speakers, So we have first 𝐂𝐚𝐧𝐚𝐝𝐬. He is the policy analyst at Development Reimagine. He's an international security analyst who focuses on geopolitics, conflict, and strategic planning in West Africa. His work examines how global systemic, regional, structural, and state societal dynamics are interacting to shape West Africa's evolving security landscape. Specifically, he analyzes how West African countries are navigating the intensifying great power competition, particularly over strategic raw minerals, security partnership, and critical infrastructure, while simultaneously managing insurgency, external interference, and state capacity constraints. In addition to analytical work, 𝐂𝐚𝐧𝐚𝐝 supports policy and dialogue processes on conflict and stabilization and security cooperation, providing strategic insight to help policymakers strengthen security. 𝐂𝐚𝐧𝐚𝐝 regularly appears on Al Jazeera, TRT World, CGTN, DW News, and BBC, among others. And his writings have been published in The Diplomat, the China Global South, the African Report, and many others. Myself, I'm a very huge fan of 𝐂𝐚𝐧𝐚𝐝. I've followed his work for a very long time now. So we're very much excited to have him join us. 𝐂𝐚𝐧𝐚𝐝, you're welcome to this dialogue. Thank you for joining us. The next on the list is Professor Philip Rao, who is a director at the China Institute at the University of Alberta. He had resumed the leadership of the China Institute in 2023, following a 25-year career in the Canadian Diplomatic Service, which included 5 postings across Greater China and 2 assignments as Consul General, heading 2 of Canada's 4 diplomatic missions in the People's Republic of China. The China Institute, where he heads as a director, serves as Canada's principal academic hub for China studies and policy dialogue. And as director, Philip has positioned the Institute at the intersection of policy and scholarship, deepening understanding of China, examining its role in emerging global challenges, and charting pathways for informed and productive Canada-China engagement. He also serves currently as adjunct professor of political science at the same university, which is the University of Alberta, and is a frequent commentator in Canadian and international media. Beyond his academic and public engagement, Philip delivers advanced China courses for the Canada School of Public Service and the Canadian Foreign Services. So obviously, we're very much excited to have Philip also join us. So thank you very much for joining us, Philip, as well. If I left out anything in your profile, please feel free in your initial comment to touch on this, but I hope I've done a good job by reading out your profile. So thank you very much, gentlemen, for making the time and for making yourself available to share your respective insights with our global audience who have joined us from all over the world. So we're going to go straight in into the discussion, and of course, I'm going to call our first speaker. 𝐂𝐚𝐧𝐚𝐝, will you go first? Or maybe Philip, I don't know who wants to go first, but we can begin your first remarks. 𝐂𝐚𝐧𝐚𝐝, okay, sure. So 𝐂𝐚𝐧𝐚𝐝, please, you have the floor. We want to hear from you. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Professor Rao. Thank you very much, Frimpong, for the invitation to participate in this very important conversation. Please pardon, there's construction work going on in the next apartment, so it's interfering. But anyway, I'll try as much as possible to speak over the noise.
Yeah.
When we look at China-Africa relationship, also within the context of international environment, it's quite interesting. And then if you add Canada as a third actor to that relationship, all of a sudden you start looking at what exactly can bring these two countries and the particular region together, right? And actually, if you really look at it critically, they really are converging forces, right? Or there are structural forces that can actually converge. So one of them is African countries actually moving from being peripheral extractive zones to actual industrial upgrading, and they want to do that through natural resource beneficiation. This is the trend of the time in the African continent, and it's a very strong push across the continent and consensus around that. Another structural force is that China is becoming increasingly integral in Africa's economic development. Right, so it was once an investor and source of finance and all of that, but now it is the continent's biggest trade partner and rapidly consolidating its position on the continent. And then thirdly, you have Canada that is actually looking to diversify its economic partnerships and engage more proactively in the world. So these three trends are almost irreversible. If you look at the condition that is creating them, the Prime Minister is very serious and is working around the clock to ensure that Canada opens up new markets, new frontiers, and also to engage with all countries across the world as much as possible where the opportunities present. So when you look at all of this together, what does that mean for a potential, triangular relationship, you could say? I would say it presents opportunity to have a multipolar stabilization mechanism for the world, because the world is really changing. Because this is more like a macro analysis now. And then two, that kind of triangular relationship will lead to a developmental coordination platform as well, and then provides a strategic optionality architecture. This is for all three, parties, right? And then when I ask the question, where exactly do these three forces and all of the three forces I mentioned driving each of the actors, and also the opportunities, what sectors or what areas, how does this really become tangible, right? And I'll say there are certain industries where this really becomes clear, where the opportunities are, and that is critical minerals and industrial value chain. So critical minerals sector is actually very, very important for the African continent, because for many African countries, the DRC, Nigeria, South Africa, Zimbabwe, etc., they are very key, and they have national development plans on how to actually move forward in this domain. You have African countries, like I mentioned, having cobalt, platinum group of metals, lithium, manganese, phosphate. And then you have China with a huge refining capacity, EV supply chain, processing infrastructure, technology, and all of that. And then Canada, possesses, real depth in terms of mining finance, in terms of ESG governance, engineering and equipment, and also pension capital. So if an African country wants to really move up that value chain, these two partners provide a lot, they bring a lot to the table, right? And then you look at it critically. So, okay, when you say what do they really bring to the table specifically, what I just mentioned now, it is obvious that one can easily point to say, oh, well, but everything that Canada can provide, China has, because if it's finance, China has finance, China has engineering, China has he set up his own ESG, what you say, standards for environmental and social responsibility and all of that. But not quite, because China does have, possesses a near complete developmental stack. Canada actually provides, very unique, or at least is stronger in certain unique sectors, and also bring certain things to the table. And this looks, what does this look like? This is diversification interoperability. If you look at the way you want to go into mining, for instance, and looking at this particular sector, Canadian participation materially improves systemic resilience. It can increase legitimacy. It can look at governance quality, and in addition to having one of the most robust stock exchange for this sector or this industry in the world. So when we look at it from that perspective, they really are complementarities, right? Securities regulation, technical certification. Again, those are other things I think Canada can bring to the triangular relationship. Now, for Africa, this really matters, right? Yes, of course, you can look at Canada as a translation layer. So Canada can function as a translation layer between developmental industrialization and Western institutional acceptance. Because as an African country, if you are going to move to really take your natural resource sector forward, you need to navigate both Chinese industrial systems, you need to navigate European regulations, you need to navigate North American market and global ESG frameworks, right? So this is where Canada really can bring everything. It can be that, like I said, translation layer. It can provide critical minerals certification. It can be crucial in that sense: traceability, sustainability reporting, environmental remediation expertise. So all of that, including his expertise in geological risk assessment, geological finance expertise as well. So all of this is to say that we cannot, as a continent, you say, many African countries will only tell you that they don't belong to any bloc and they want to actually engage with all parties. And the question that always becomes, okay, well, we don't need to engage with so many people on everything. Like some sectors, we can work with one country or one party in that regard. And I always make the argument, yes, you can, but because you can doesn't mean you should. If you can increase cooperation and participation, it actually makes whatever system and modality you're working with stronger, right? Especially when the parties you are bringing together are not really competing with each other, they are going to be complementing each other, right? And this is one of the strongest cases for this triangular relationship, because everybody brings something strong to the table. So the way to then look at that is, okay, well, if African countries, and I speak really from the looking at the African perspective, where I be conversant of the fact that Africa is many countries, but African countries that have a natural resource beneficiation strategy and want to use their resources to move ahead, where China can finance large projects through state banks, for instance. Canadian systems are actually, if you look at it to some extent, are actually very excellent and also integrated into global private capital markets. They have good institutional investors, pension system, international legal financial architecture, right? So this becomes where African states want to diversify their financing sources. I think that's good to mention, and access Western investment pools. But again, there are other sectors that we could look at, like agriculture and food systems, which is another area where Canada is also very good. But the thing with that sector is there are some European countries that are way ahead of Canada in that regard. When I say by way ahead, I mean they already have a lot of stronger market presence, and they possess almost exactly the same kind of skills in agriculture, like precision agriculture, for instance, is an area where Canada is very strong. In Ontario here, there's so many, greenhouse, large farms for greenhouse, and Africa needs to improve its agriculture, right? So yes, of course, there's something to be discussed in that sector. However, but in Netherlands, for instance, is much bigger player in African continent, and also institutionally embedded, because it has one of the most advanced agricultural industries in the world, right? So why I'm mentioning agriculture, for instance, and the other sectors like AI and tech governance, why I'm mentioning that all of this is why there are several sectors where this triangular relationship can produce good results. The resource or critical minerals and mining value chain is actually the one where it is structurally strongest, and the complementarity is the strongest. And I'm not saying that it should be limited to this, but I say start with what already Canada is a major investor in mining in African countries, right? So this is already the bread and butter of the Canada-Africa relationship. And very recently there were so many there's some deals in the gold sector, for instance, between actually involving Chinese, Canadian, and an African country. So to wrap up, I'll say what are the conditions for this triangular relationship to be viable? One of them is, and the first of all, is to acknowledge the reality that there is increased confrontation among blocs. So there's the G7 countries, which Canada is one of, and then you have China at its position as a rival to this bloc. So if that bloc mentality can be a stumbling block, pun not intended, to this triangular relationship, there also needs to be minimizing of ideological positions when it comes to developing the relationship. Ensure sequencing of cooperation in sectors, and then preserving autonomy of all parties. African countries always say they want to diversify that because they want autonomy. Canada also wants autonomy. That's why it wants to increase its footprint and economic participation in the world. China is very serious about its autonomy as well too. So if you look at all the issue of autonomy and diversification, all of that, it benefits everyone, and can actually lead to Africa's developmental goals, Chinese industrial expansion, Canada's diversification away from overdependence on any one supply chain, and actually increase the strategic position in the world. So I'll stop there for now and allow Professor to come in and enlighten us with his contribution. Thank you.
Right. Thank you very much, 𝐂𝐚𝐬. I thank you for setting the tone. Rightly so. I mean, the key point that you've raised, I think, when you started off by giving the positioning, right? I mean, what the African ambition is, natural resource beneficiation, the industrialization agenda and ambitions, and why it's not debatable in terms of what China's present and what he has created or shaped the kind of engagements with Africa, and how it used to be and how it is now because of China's presence, which is not debatable. And again, as you rightly mentioned, some of the key attributes of Canada that can actually be positioned as not reactionary response to China, but actually more like a long-term strategic partnership lens, right? Which is very key, and that's the kind of debate we want to engineer, the kind of debate we want to keep having, that it's not so much about reacting to what China is doing in Africa, but rather what will be in the long-term strategic interest and partnership, logic. And I think that's very key. And rightly mentioned some of the key sector. Of course, some of the leading mining corporations in Africa are from Canada, as we know. And so thank you very much for setting the tone. I have a couple of questions, but I will leave that to when Philip finishes, and then we'll get into the Q&A. So please, if you are still on, please do send in your questions you have to what Ovig has already mentioned. Otherwise, we welcome Professor Rowe to take over. So, Prof, please, you have the floor. Thank you.
Okay, well, thank you, and greetings, everyone, and thank you for the invitation and the kind introduction a bit earlier, Paul. I've been looking forward to this conversation with a great deal of enthusiasm, but also a healthy dose of humility, given the breadth of the topic and the limits of my own particular expertise. But I'll do my best, and I think Ovigwe has already given it a really good framing, so I think it's going to be a good conversation. Before I dive in, maybe a couple additional introductory remarks. You gave a good introduction to what our institute does, Paul. I'd like to maybe elaborate just a bit because we've been trying to give it a bit more focus since I've arrived. One of the things, we basically have four main areas that we're trying to work on. Again, both in terms of supporting scholars, but also providing policy relevant research work as well. The first one is we're trying to deepen understanding of China and China competency in Canada, because right now there's an asymmetry between, I think, competency on North America in China versus competency on China in North America. So we're doing a lot of work on that front. We're also quite active in terms of trying to provide informed and productive advice to the Canadian government with respect to how to move forward on Canada-China relations. But we don't just do Canada-China. We also take a look at how China impacts some of the big global questions that are also relevant to Canada. We've already touched on a couple, but others would include health, energy, food, of course, mining, etc. And the reason I'm going through this, Paul, is because the fourth one is an area we tried to start exploring a couple of years ago that's always been obvious as a field, but becoming increasingly relevant. And that's trying to take a look at how middle powers can navigate the emerging great power rivalry dynamic, if you will, and not just in terms of how they should react to that dynamic, but also trying to figure out how maybe they can seize a mantle of agency and carve out some space. I think that's very much an area where both Canada and a lot of the small and middle powers in Africa are converging in terms of their thinking, and perhaps something we can explore a bit later in terms of, like, are there ways for Canada and Africa to work together, not only in reaction to China and the United States, but in complement to, and trying to create some space there. I might also share at a very personal level, when I was many years ago, when I was a young lawyer, a reluctant lawyer who had always wanted to be working on international affairs. My first desire was to work in the field of development, and I tried to join the Canadian International Development Agency, but they wouldn't have me. So I ended up going through the diplomatic service instead. And after a short stint in Latin America, I ended up spending the next 25 years in China. So, of course, development is relevant in China too, but it's a very different dynamic. So I'm actually really delighted that, now, given my quote unquote kind of China competency, I can start to kind of like put my mind to not just development, but working with Africa. And maybe this is an area that we can deepen exploration together in the future. I might also say that, when I first arrived in China to work there, it was in 2001. It was very different China than what we have today. It was a very exciting time. China was really starting to open up. It had basically just joined the WTO. It was trying to host the 2008 Olympics. Everyone was optimistic about China's development. Many people were thinking that as it would evolve economically, it might also evolve politically. And also domestically in China, there was a lot of curiosity and openness to the world. There still is, but it's expressing itself in a different way today. The other thing that was going on, and I was very fortunate in my first assignment to have as one of my files I was covering something called the Western Development Strategy, which basically was a domestic precursor to the Belt and Road Initiative. And so for several years, I had the incredible opportunity to basically travel around China and observe how China was trying to develop its less developed regions. And indeed, you know, if you go back to 25 years ago, many parts of China, especially away from the coast, were in very low levels of development. And it was interesting to see China's approach. Even domestically, its approach at the time was heavy investment in infrastructure, over capacity building, with the belief, you know, the Chinese still have a saying, they say, 𝐂𝐴 which basically means, you know, if you want to become rich, you have to build a road, right? So in other words, it's really infrastructure that leads to prosperity. I think China's approach, both domestically and internationally, has evolved, but it's interesting to see that echo between the two, and provides a bit of insight on the ongoing dynamics between China and developing countries around the world. Now, 𝐂𝐚𝐬, I think, as I dive into a few more specific remarks, I think there's really a lot of complementarity between what you've been suggesting and what I might have to share with the group. There has been no coordination in advance, I promise everyone, but there's some decent overlap. Maybe one difference, though, as a non-Africa specific subject matter expert, I actually have woven into my remarks a couple of questions that perhaps Paul or you or the audience can help me elucidate as we go along. So maybe my first point that I'd like to make, and I think maybe I will skip very quickly over that, but my point is, we need to be, as Canadians, we need to be focusing on Africa more urgently and more practically. I know that we have a new Africa strategy. There's some trade and development resources, significant ones that are focused on the continent. But I think when we take a look at the pace of China's engagement with Africa and the potential complementarities between Canada and Africa, there's a need to kind of press on the gas, if you will, and accelerate that engagement, because there's still a window. But China's engagement with the continent as a whole is so comprehensive and proceeding at such a pace that at some point that window of opportunity will start to narrow. And at the same time, I think the reality of many parts of Africa is ahead of the rhetoric in terms of the practical opportunities, its pace of development, economic growth, and also complementarities. I don't think that you know, even not just the broader public, but even Canadian policymakers fully appreciate the short but also medium to long-term opportunities that a doubling down on paying attention to Africa might entail. Now, if we narrow the lens a little bit and take a look at both Canada and China and Africa, you know, my sense is, and again, overlaps with a bit of what 𝐂𝐚𝐬 was saying, I think there's not that much convergence between what Canada and China are doing in Africa, except in areas such as the extractive sector, right? And so that means in some ways there's a lot of space for both countries to engage Africa in a relatively non-competitive way. And indeed, there may be some spaces that we can explore that offer cooperative and complementary engagement as well. The other thing that's interesting is that these areas where there is overlap between Canada and China are mostly still driven by Chinese state-owned actors, whereas in a lot of the other aspects of China's engagement with Africa, it's the private sector that's driving the pace. So there's also a kind of qualitative difference between the kind of actors with whom Canada would either compete or work with or operate in parallel. So that's maybe another point that's worth looking at. As 𝐂𝐚𝐬 mentioned, I mean, there's a lot of areas where that overlap and intersection is becoming more salient. So, you know, there's a big Canadian initiated, in many cases, mining projects where over time there's been a Chinese partner that's become involved, right? Think of Ivanhoe in the Congo or First Quantum in Zambia, et cetera. So it's interesting to see how those dynamics are playing out. And in fact, beyond Canada, maybe the most visible example that also kind of can be thought-provoking is the Simandou project in Guinea, right? Where you have Rio Tinto working with Chalco together, trying to amalgamate Western approaches to ESG with Chinese approaches to ESG in a way that can work for both sides, that's consistent with international norms, with raising money on capital markets and the objectives of the respective partners. It's really very interesting to see how that is playing out. I think at the most simple level, a question that we maybe can unpack a little bit later would be, do these partnerships between Canadian, for example, and Chinese extractive companies in Africa, do they lead to a bit of a march to the top when it comes to ESG, or so basically dragging the standards higher through that Canada-China cooperation, or do it leads to a sliding a little bit further down the bottom compared to just a solely owned Canadian kind of project in Africa? And what does that entail for the future, I think, is an interesting question. Another issue to my mind that also kind of relates to Canada and other middle powers as well as China is and we might not want to dwell too much on the US, but it's this this is just so recent, right? It's just this American the change in the nature of American engagement with Africa, right? The USAID is basically completely retrenched. And it's a much more practical kind of commercial-based engagement between the U.S. and Africa, I believe. And so what does that mean in a post kind of USAID world on the softer side of engagement? What can middle powers do, and what is China doing? I mean, I think it's fair to say that we don't have the same resources, so we can't in any way pretend that middle powers can replace the U.S. presence. But if they can't, which areas should they be working on? And are there areas? Most people will reflexively push back at this question in Canada, I think, but I still feel like asking it, which is, are there areas where actually, for example, a Canada-China joint activity in the development space might actually make sense, right? I think for a lot of people, that's anathema. I do think that topic needs to be approached with sensitivity and caution, but I think that to kind of just close out that possibility completely is also perhaps not the best way of thinking about it. I know, Paul, we might talk about this a bit later, but this whole idea of middle power agency is, I think, a very interesting one. Maybe quickly I can share. I was just in China for some high-level closed-door meetings with Chinese government and academic leaders. It was very interesting conversation. I'm happy to share more about the broader range of things we discussed, but certainly on middle powers, it was very interesting because in the post-Davos Prime Minister Carney's speech Davos world, actually right now Canada, deservedly or not, or rightfully or wrongfully, is holding a bit of a mantle of leadership when it comes to middle power thinking. We'll see if we can live up to those expectations over time. But even in China, they see Canada now in a bit of a different light in terms of its ability to forge a new path, distinct from the American one, and perhaps in concert with or independently from other small and middle powers. And they try to articulate a global vision in which that could fit. So, without getting into too much detail, I would just say that when we had the conversations about middle powers at this dialogue in China, the Chinese participants consistently would try to frame it more or less as follows, the U.S. has been irresponsible, engaging in disorderly conduct, making the world less uncertain. We're entering a period of unstable world where it's multipolar, etc., and people need to work together. In other words, China will kind of try its best to uphold a new form of international order, and all middle powers should work with it to do that, right? Whereas I think from the Canadian perspective, it's more about examining whether or not there is agency on the part of a constellation of small and middle powers together, working in concert on issues-based coalitions to try to either preserve some aspects of the existing global order that work, or iterate new ones that would work better, or as a group serve as the ballast or the swing vote between the U.S. and China in order to ensure that the future trajectory of global governance is actually a positive one. So a very different conception of what a middle power agency might mean. And I think on that front, a lot of interesting thinking that can be done with respect to how Canada and Africa can work together. I think maybe I'll just touch on one or two more things very quickly. I have a few more notes here on extractive industries, but I think you already covered that very well. better than I would have. I also think that we should try to not forget the power of the Canada brand, which again, deservedly or not, still remains strong in areas like ESG, but also in terms of governance standards, responsible business practices, and capacity building. So is there ways that we can play a role that is either that helps to build capacity in China, in Africa, in a way where then Africa is better empowered to engage with its primary interlocutor these days, which is China. So that's another way maybe to kind of look at it. And of course, there's a strategic urgency to all of this. I think, other themes I'll just throw out there. I think that, Africa actually has, beyond its strengths, also has some incredible opportunities. We're in a world now where technology is driving a lot of change, and in fact, compared to some of the more established industrial countries, Africa has a chance to kind of leapfrog to a new economy status where it can kind of adopt AI in a way that's disruptive but also empowering without worrying about legacy impacts. It can play an interesting role on critical minerals, such as you was talking about, and again, kind of circling back to the middle powers here topic, there's a lot of countries in Africa. They have a lot of influence in multilateral fora. They have a lot of influence at the UN. And, in a situation now where perhaps we're looking for middle power agency vis-a-vis US and China, there's an opportunity there to be definers of norms instead of takers of norms. And again, I think there's a lot of interesting creative thinking that could be done, because China, as you all know, is actually quite successful in terms of filling the vacuum left by the United States in multilateral fora and iterating new forms of kind of global governance norms that on the surface seem perfectly acceptable, but are, incrementally more and more aligned with the way China wants to kind of like evolve its presence in the world. So something where we need to be both vigilant and constructive. Maybe I'll leave it there for now. I very much appreciated Ōgīboe's comments as well, and happy to add a bit more later.
Yeah, sure. Thank you very much, Philip. That was very insightful. So we've heard from both our speakers, the opening remarks from our speakers, which are very insightful, I must say. So we are getting to the third phase, which is the Q&A session. I have a couple of follow-up questions to our respective speakers, but more so, we would like to hear from you. I said there are a couple of questions that have come through the Q&A. So if you have questions, please do send them through the Q&A button, and then we'll moderate it. If you have a specific speaker you want to ask the question to, please mention the speaker's name so that we can just directly ask the speaker. I'm going to start off a question for Philip. I'm going to start off with you since you just gave a very broader sense of where Canada is and what Canada could do, both on the side of Canada, China, in the global governance space for middle power countries, as well as even Canada and Africa. So that's very, on your first key point, you did mention that looking at how aggressive, not aggressive word, I'm using the aggressive advisedly, how embedded, or more like how entrenched China's role in Africa has become. It presents, of course, a window of opportunity, where Canada can, of course, also play the complementary role. But if Canada is not more strategic, that what that could mean is that there could be a potential maybe close down that opportunity, right? So as you said, Canada's approach to Africa must be so my question is, given that pace and scale of China's engagement, right? In what practical terms, what does that look like? If you say Canada can be more practical and more strategic, in terms of engagement in Africa, how does it look like to you from where you sit? Maybe from best examples, as you did mention about the Western development strategy when during your time in China. So how does it look like, looking at how the pace and the scale of China's engagement in Africa? Yeah.
Yeah, well, that's a great question. I mean, I think there's many ways, but there's a few. Like maybe I can start with what I see as a couple of kind of low-hanging fruit, if you will,
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
And and in some cases, it's not necessarily to do things differently than China, but actually maybe learn from them in terms of how to be more effective to the advantage of
Yeah.
Africa.
Yeah.
So there's some areas even where I think they'd both be accretive to African economic development and to enhancing Canadian soft power brand, right? So there's two things that, for example, in that field come to mind to me. One is education. I've spent more or less the last 25 of the last 28 years of my life in China.
Mm.
It's very impressive to see, especially in recent years, how many resources and focus China has put on offering scholarships to young Africans to go to Chinese universities, both in terms of studying the humanities, but also the hard sciences, medical schools, etc. And the tangible benefit to these African students is immense. But the soft power benefit to China is huge as well, right? And there's two reasons for that. The one is perhaps more instrumentalized, which is, you become attuned to Chinese style of education, certain Chinese values are being propagated, et cetera. But I think the more important side of it is actually if you go to China and you live there for 3 or 4 years, you just get to know the place, you create friendships, you create connections, the people-to-people ties become stronger. And as these African students return to Africa, grow up, become influential members of their own respective societies, then those ties between them and China become more and more relevant and useful, right? So I think we need to start investing in the long term in Canada to do the same thing. I don't think the cost of this is very high. I think it's more about vision and political will and a strategic understanding that this is an intersection between soft power and economic and African development that actually very, very, very much win-win, right? I think we've been a bit neglectful on that side. Another area that comes to mind to me, and maybe this wouldn't apply to the entire continent, but I think the economic benefits would be real, but the symbolic impact would even be greater, and that's on trade policy.
Yeah.
My understanding is, basically, with one or two exceptions, China has now a zero tariff posture with respect to all of Africa, right? In the case of Canada, I think we're more kind of zero tariff for just the least developed countries in Africa, but everyone else is basically subject to some tariffs. And if you look at it in the broader scheme of things, Canada-Africa trade is around $15 billion in bilateral trade. It's not insignificant, but it's the impact of adjusting our trade policy there would not cause a lot of hardship. I'm sure there are ways to protect any domestic industries that would be affected by such a policy change, or even if there were a couple of small carve-outs for very sensitive sectors, just basically have a blanket, with very few exceptions, a blanket approach where we say from now on we're moving to zero tariffs with all of Africa. I don't know if you would agree, Paul, but the symbolic impact of that in terms of demonstrating that Canada is back, Canada cares about Africa, Canada is in it for the long term, and here's a symbolic example of our commitment. I think that would go a long way, right? I also mentioned capacity building. I think, in some areas, including less sexy areas, but areas like trade policy, for example, to stay in that field. These are, international trade policy negotiations quite difficult. Canada is one of the most engaged countries in the world on trade policy. We depend on international trade for a larger part of our GDP than just about any other developed country. We have free trade deals negotiated with we're the only G7 country that has a free trade deal negotiated with every other G7 country. These are difficult negotiations.
Yeah.
We're getting ready to deal with the renewal of the Canada, US, Mexico free trade agreement. Challenging negotiations again. We've been dealing with China a long time. I guess my point is we have a deep pool of trade policy expertise.
Yeah.
And I know that we've been doing this more actively in Southeast Asia with ASEAN partner countries, but working with certain African partner countries on enhancing their kind of trade policy negotiation capabilities, I think would actually be very helpful, even in terms of helping to move some kind of African pan-African free trade project forward in a more accelerated and effective way. I think this is an area we could work on. The other thing that just comes to mind, I'll stop there because I could go on and on, and this is maybe an answer, but this is a potential insight right? Which is as we look to Canada's presence in Africa and China's presence in Africa, and even as we examine potential areas where the three could work together, I think Africa can also see, for example, in the extractive field, that Canada can be seen as a diversification play, right? Because now your main interlocutor is China, but it's not always good to have all your eggs in the same basket. We're learning that ourselves with respect to the Americans right now. And so, you know, where the competencies, as you were saying, 𝐂𝐚𝐬, are comparable, perhaps that's just one reason why you might want to work with Canada instead of China in some cases in order to balance out the leverage long term vis-a-vis Africa. So.
Yeah, thank you very much, Flip. I think those 4 points you raised are very key. And of course, I mean, the point that you mentioned about, you know, a trade policy angle, which could be very symbolic, right? It shows that yes, I'm here as a strategic partner, that I understand the relevance of trade, and basically, I think that's very key, and that's what China is doing. You know, as you rightly said, the zero tariff policy for 53 countries that have diplomatic relations with China. And of course, it's something that we've been working on since the policy came out, was, you know, in effect from 1st May. We've been working along on that. We've gotten a lot of publication on it, and we are still working on a couple of projects regarding that zero tariff policy implementation from China since 1st May. So I think those are very key. Of course, even more symbolic, we know the US AGOA, you know, is also a very symbolic, you know, example, right? The African Growth Opportunity Act from the US, you know, which also that trade, you know, policy engagement between US and Africa. And I think, you know, an angle from that on the China and the Canada side was very key and very symbolic. Thank you very much for sharing those insights. I'll have a question for 𝐂𝐚𝐬, and then we'll go into some of the questions that have been sent in from the audience. So I want to touch briefly on infrastructure, 𝐂𝐚𝐬. As you know, a critical part of what Africa has been trying to achieve, you know, over the period for so long a time now. I'm sure you have the number, development reimagining. You guys have done a lot of work on that infrastructure financing gap. And we know China is obviously a big part of that, you know, in terms of the financing in that scope. Where do you see Canada, just like you mentioned the strategy in terms of the value addition and beneficiation, the ESG that Canada brings, you know, in terms of standards, in terms of infrastructure financing ambition of Africa? What would that look like? Looking at already the role that China is playing, I mean, what could be that, you know, in terms of Africa, China, Canada, in the context of Africa's infrastructure development and ambitions? Yeah, just briefly.
Yeah. So if we're going to narrow it down to infrastructure for this potential triangular relationship, I think the one area of infrastructure where it would really bring all parties together would be climate resilient infrastructure. So Canada is big and huge when it comes to the climate movement, right? And also because of its own climate now, it has certain, you know, expertise for working out the modalities for construction in extreme temperatures. Of course, African countries are on the opposite end when it comes to climate. African countries are hot almost all year round. However, there are key infrastructure projects, like, for example, hydroelectric dams, right? Energy transition project or infrastructure. I think that's one kind of infrastructure where there is shared interest, because of Canada is a major hydro power, just like China is as well. Like in Quebec and some provinces here, almost the entire province is powered by hydroelectricity. So they have deep expertise in that regard. Even nuclear energy as well too. So there's something they call CANDU nuclear reactor, which was developed here in Canada as well. African countries are also very key to build up their nuclear industry. I mean, there's just recently probably still going on, Africa's Nuclear Energy Summit or I mean, it's taking place in Rwanda, for example. In Africa's nuclear energy market, already China and Russia are actually racing to the top, right? Russia has Russia has the most deals with African countries currently. China has a very promising sector in terms of its small modular reactors as well. And then Canada, of course, has its own CANDU reactor, right? So already African countries have opportunity, or you say optionality.
Yeah, yeah.
And it will not be surprising to see that some countries might find that there's more complementarity doing a collaboration with Canada and China to have to build something, whether it's, like I said, hydroelectric dams or it's in the nuclear reactors. So there are specific type of infrastructure projects that like just mentioned now, where I think that really sits in the middle of this tripartite or triangular relations. I think I would limit it. I would say those two are strong. Of course, there might be others that one can think of.
Yeah, sure. Thank you very much, Ovigo, for that feedback. There's a question here from Jacqueline. So I think that will be more suited for Prof. Ro. So she's asking that how does rising China-Canada relations contribute to securities and technical regulations on the part of China? So is there potential for international pressure? So I don't know whether the question is clear enough, Flip. So how does rising Canada-China relation contribute to securities and technical regulations on China's part? Is there potential for international pressure? Is the question clear?
Well, I mean, I think there's maybe an assumption in there I can try to unpack. I mean, I think for any country, but especially a country like Canada, that's always kind of has its a vision of itself as a a country that has a foreign policy that is values informed. When you engage with China, there's always a bit of a difficult question there, which is how deeply do we want to engage? How much can we combine values with commercial relations? Those kinds of questions. I think the current Canadian policy under Prime Minister Carney is clear. It's basically we want to engage where we see opportunity, but with guardrails, right? So I think on the security side, on the norm side, there's probably not always going to be a perfect alignment between Canada and China, but hopefully in a more stabilized bilateral relationship, there will be an opportunity to discuss those issues more effectively. I think the only other thing I might add is if you then try to transpose that question into the middle powers kind of dynamic, if Canada, small and medium-sized powers in Africa and others come to an agreement on what types of international norms with respect to security, with respect to certain other big questions should apply, then as a group we might be able to have more influence.
All right. Thank you very much for that feedback. Ovigo, there's a question here that I think is directed to you. So the person is a Gabriel from Ghana, I guess, asking that to the question. I'm just trying to paraphrase because the structure. So he's saying that for most parts, there's a gap in terms of the social intervention that companies, especially in the extractive sector, do, especially from China, where they leave most of the extractive towns and those places more impoverished after those extraction or exploration. So that's more environmental and social concern question. So the question is, do we need to be clear about do we mean Ghana or Africa? To be clear in the terms of the agreement that we signed, that's, I'm sure, is a question about African agents. So if you can just briefly touch on that. Yeah.
Yes, the mining sector, I mean, if it's known for anything, is that it can be very, very devastating on the environment, and that's something African countries have been suffering for decades. You could even say stretching all the way back to when we started doing mining landscape post-independence, and there have been some projects, Chinese projects on the continent, where we've seen this problem. one of the main things I always say when it comes to this is that if you take the average African country, it has a mining code, right? And every so often, we would even see that we, myself and colleagues at Development Reimagined, we always push for aligning that African countries' mining code and all of that to the African mining vision, which is far broad, which always very broad, includes sustainability and all of that. But beyond just alignment, important question is enforcement.
Yeah.
Right. So if you give a concession, if you have an investor who comes in to mine, you have the primary responsibility to ensure that the mining project does not, pose environmental threats to the community, to even if there are no people living in a place, the ecosystem needs to be protected. And if you look at the scale of mining projects across the continent, this questioner is talking about Chinese mining company, for instance, the ratio of where you have problems to where there are no problems, I think African countries are, on a general scale, are doing a lot much better than people think, because in any particular country alone, you can have, in some countries, up to even half a dozen to a dozen Chinese mining projects going on. And if you're seeing problems maybe in a few countries or in some mining projects in certain countries, then that awareness that project needs to be situated in this greater scale of mining going on across the continent. That said, African countries need to take that enforcement very, very seriously. This is why I even mentioned, as part of the area where there needs to be that coordination, or where Canada can come in with strengthening that regulatory infrastructure, right, to ensure that we have real standards, ESG standards, or at least learn from what is being done here, sustainability reporting, and even where there's poor enforcement on the government side, environmental remediation. So these expertise are very, very strong here on the there are places where Canada has lots of strength, and I think African countries can tap it. So not even just Canada alone. There are several other partners who have those, who have very excellent capacity in this space.
Right.
If I may, I'm just kind of curious, because many of us in Canada, I guess there's a presumption amongst many of us in Canada that, let's say Canadian mining companies operating in Africa, they're certainly not perfect. They don't have a perfect record, but I think there's an assumption that in the balance, they are more responsible and have less of a negative impact than their Chinese counterparts when it comes to the extractive industries in China. Is that a fair assumption, or would you challenge that, or can you enlighten us a bit more compare a bit the experience on the ground?
Well, I think it depends on what you are measuring. And first of all, to say, I've never really seen any research that have done a like-for-like comparison to start with. Because if we're going to say, okay, one person is more compliant with environmental regulation and standards, then there needs to be a research that says this is the data that shows that we're comparing Barrick Gold with maybe Zijin or another companies. So that research has not really, at least I've not seen anything in that regard. But overwhelmingly, if you look at we could say the word on the street, or what people would say, it is not necessarily one is better than the other, but I think there is a sense that Canadian companies, because of the practice and where they are coming from. So the characteristic of Canada's own very strong and stringent environmental regulation for decades. In China, for instance, they've gotten really, really strict in the last maybe 15, 20 years since they really making that transition from heavy industries to advanced manufacturing. You could see China has really cleaned up its air, cleaned up its water system, all of that, right? So if you are a young mining engineer that grew up in today's China, your perception of what is standard is going to be way better than someone who grew up in the 70s or in the 80s who saw a different China, right? So I think that's one of the things that you're going to notice in terms of that comparison. That said, even if you now look at compliance, so if we put environmental is one thing, but what about other compliance in terms of I give you an example with issue with Barry Gold. So you see, Barry Gold had a problem with Mali very recently, and if you notice how that has been resolved, you could say the Canadian company has been very, very responsive to the change in regulatory environment. It fought it stumbled, it complained, but it has essentially signed on to the mining code. We have comparison to with Chinese companies as well. So if you look at Ghana, for instance, has changed its gold mining code, and that's affected everybody. But both Chinese companies have complained, American companies have complained. So we see these things happening on both sides. And I think over time, what the African countries are realizing is that yes, you might sign an agreement with whether they're coming from the US or the European Union or Canada or America. If you do not really push, you don't get, like, you have the responsibility just because as a matter of fact, you have responsibility and the agency, so you have to push to say this is the norm, this is the standard, you must follow this standard, right? And I think that is where we are seeing a lot of pressure now being applied as African countries are talking about beneficiation. That means they're going to do more mining and more exploration, all of that. That means the risk of pollution is also going to increase, right? And it is why the pressure and momentum needs to be maintained in terms of increasing regulatory architecture, which further strengthens the case that I've been making, and you, Professor Rowe, have been making about getting partners like Canada that have long-established expertise into the mix as Africa is navigating this industrial upgrading.
Yeah, thank you. I think that's an area that we can actually explore. I mean, ACCPA and the China Institute, I think we can look at that. I mean, and to look at into that study of that comparison study, as Ovidio mentioned, to see if we can find some evidence and tangible, basis, in terms of what's happening in the extractive sector, the role of Canada, the role of China, and how the convergence can work, where there are differences. So I think that would be very, very, very interesting thing to pursue. I'm hopeful that it's something that we can explore later on. So there's a question here from Templar, our guy. So Templar is asking, is it okay, Prof? The question is actually to you, but of course, both of you can also touch on it. So he's saying that you mentioned that Canada's pursuit of independent middle power posture towards China and Beijing's willingness to engage China within that framework raises an important question in the African context as well. So the question is, can Canada practically articulate a more sovereign and strategically coherent middle power approach toward African states and institutions? And then there's another further question where he's asking, where do you both, that is you and Ovigwe, see the strongest areas of alignment between Canadian and African strategic interests that could allow Canada to establish credibility, agency, and long-term relevance as a partner across the continent? So I don't know if you need me to read through the question or it's all good.
Okay, well, I'll give it a shot, and then maybe my colleague can jump in as well. Well, I think it's useful to take a step back for a moment, Templar, and as I'm sure you've done, but to try to frame the answer. I think we're in a different kind of middle powers dynamic now than anything we've seen in recent history, anyway. You don't have to go back that far. If you look at, for example, assuming that we accept the framing here, where it's kind of we're in a new great power rivalry dynamic between the U.S. and China. it's very different, for example, than what existed during the Cold War, between Moscow and Washington, basically two competing visions. Everyone had to line up behind one or the other. It was very difficult to be in the middle space between the two, right? So there was not a lot of opportunity for agency. You basically had to line up with one block or the other. And I think as you kind of move to in the 90s and the early thousands to a more kind of like unipolar world, even when that was starting to fray, if we go back, for example, to the global financial crisis epoch, I think more agency was available for middle powers then, but the level of development and prosperity of many of the potential middle power players was too low, and so they could not really afford to the luxury of being more independent. Right? I think right now we're in a very different space. Right? First of all, much of the developing world and the global south is richer than it was, even though there's still a lot of work to do. Most larger middle powers, while they have their fiscal constraints, they're quite economically kind of they have a lot of agency economically, and also maybe most importantly, to my mind anyway, is that there's an asymmetry between the two great powers, right? So in the sense that the U.S., I think it's fair to say, from a military perspective, its ability to project power and force around the world, it's still peerless. But it's only doing it selectively, and otherwise it's basically retrenching. It doesn't have the desire to be the guarantor of peace and stability for the world anymore, right? So that opens up space on the security side. Not sure China actually wants to take up that space, right? Economically, a bit different, right? The U.S. again is almost deliberately retrenching a bit, but it's still a major trading power. I think it's fair to say China probably does have kind of hegemonic economic ambition, but not security, right? So actually, there's no perfect symmetry between the two powers at play here, which creates a lot more space to play around with for the middle powers. Now, how does that translate to Canada and Africa? Well, it depends, but we should be maybe meeting together to identify areas of key priority. And I think on the Canadian side, also, it requires a bit of a cultural shift. We have a tendency to not only work with small and middle powers, but mostly work with very like-minded small and middle powers. I think it's time probably in the current global dynamic to move to working with various partners on various issues, right? So kind of issues-based coalitions that can advance key areas, right? And which areas? I mean, it really depends. I mean, do we want to work together on strengthening the WTO? We're probably all going to be concerned about emerging issues such as AI governance, probably an area that we probably want to work on together, where Canada can have quite a bit of influence, high seas protection, biodiversity issues, climate change. Right? There's a whole list of areas where we could work together. But I think the first point is to really appreciate how much agency and influence we could have if we frame it properly.
Yeah. Thank you very much for that insight. Yeah, I mean, when the dynamics are changing, when the countries are taking position, of course, what is left in there and what countries like Canada and of course countries middle power can do. I think that's very insightful. Thank you very much for the feedback. Ovige, do you have any comments on that question from Templar before we can take maybe our last but one question?
Yeah, from a perspective, Canada has to engage with the world way more than it has done, perhaps since its founding. and I say that because the world, Canada's foreign policy, if you look at it, it's really rooted in a liberal international order. Like it's liberal institutional kind of approach to multilateralism, and even just like Professor Rose said, now even that through that liberal lens, it chooses the kind of partners it wants to engage with bilaterally, right? But that world no longer exists, right? The world has changed from that post-Cold War liberal order, and we're moving towards what I've written about now, a new mercantilist kind of international environment, right? So it has to, and if a country like the United States, it is not just a neighbor, but it is wedded with Canada in ways that you cannot even just explain theoretically. It's signaling that you have to go fend for yourself in certain ways. Then it tells you how serious the government needs to take that building itself in the world and projecting itself in the world. And from that perspective, it needs to be said that while Canada might not have the robustness of the United States, it does have a lot of credibility, especially in the UN system. So from an African perspective, if you ask an African what they think about Canada, I think three things will come to mind. Peace and security, peacekeeping, because of peacekeeping legacy that Canada has in the UN system, immigration, and education. These are the three things the average person in an African country would think of when they think about Canada. Now, across these three pillars, you can actually build serious credibility. Not just you have credibility in these three areas, you can actually build serious influence because of that. If people look to you as a place of countries see you as a place for elite formation, to get STEM education and build capacity, that's great, right? That's been one of the main ways US has been able to get a lot of influence in the world and the UK as well. If at the time where multilateralism is threatened and you still have that credibility, and after that speech by Prime Minister Carney, people are really excited again about what Canada thinks about international environment, and you have that legacy of being a main country in the UN system, particularly UN peace keeping. Now that we're talking about UN Security Council reform and African countries that are pushing for fair representation, that's an opportunity for Canada to actually to come in and say, okay, let's sit down and talk about exactly what you want. And it doesn't have to just be with Africa. Brazil wants representation. India is talking about the same thing as well, too, right? So it has the opportunity to actually go into the world and say, yes, we can collaborate on this issue. So these things might not necessarily lead to increase in GDP next year, but they really build the architecture for long-term influence. And it is that influence that you can then leverage to open up trade, partnerships, strengthen commercial interests, and tap into, because you then have a lot of pull. If as a Canadian business you are going to an African country, because you are likely to meet someone who was educated in Canada, for instance. So there is a kind of familiarity, and it opens doors because there is that familiarity, right? So there is a lot that can be done. It just needs to be sequenced in a way that and explain that this is going to be long term and not necessarily about getting economic deals tomorrow or next tomorrow. There's a space for that, and which we have discussed, which is the mining sector. But for looking at global architecture, this has to be articulated as something that requires time, and it will definitely pay off in the long term.
Right. Thank you very much for that insightful feedback. I'm going to add the last question, and then we take your final comments, and then we'll make it a wrap. I hope that is fair, because we're almost on our time now. So the last question is from Jacqueline. She's asking a broad stroke question. She's saying that South-South cooperation occurred back in the Bandung Conference. I think this is very historical. China was still a rising power back then. So she's asking if we compare and contrast that relation with current relations with middle power, that's Canada and the global majority Africa. I don't know if the question is clear. I'm sure you guys have touched on this, here and there. So comparing what was happening in the Bandung Conference, South-South cooperation, and what's happening now in our world today, if you can just give a bit of comment on maybe what is different, at the time and now.
Well, I find that maybe to give my colleague a chance to reflect and give a fuller answer, I'll start with a couple of impressions. One thing that has struck me in the last few years is it's not necessarily deliberate or ill-willed, but I do find there's a bit of a double discourse coming from Beijing sometimes. It wants to position itself still in some cases as a developing country and as a kind of like first among equals with the global South and the developing world. And in other cases, it really presents itself as a completely different animal, much larger, more influential, right? So already there, you can kind of see very different reality from the Bandung era, right, of China engaging with the global South at that time. And so that'd be the first thing. The second thing is, as we just talked about, there's a global space now where China is a partial global leader, but not a full one. And at the same time, you have a retrenching America that creates a lot of space for everyone to jockey for. And as a group, middle powers, if they work properly, can actually either be the ballast, the swing vote, or the iterator of a better global order. So I think it's really up to us to define which areas we think are worth prioritizing, whether it's climate, whether it's international trade organizations reform, whether it's governance initiatives, whether it's a focus on AI governance. I mean, there's maybe many things we work on together.
Yeah.
But we need to prioritize sequence and maybe seize the opportunity to fill that vacuum. And in some cases, China might choose to join our efforts, and in some cases, it might not. But the agency, the potential for the agency now lies with us. I think if we can seize that mantle.
Right. Thank you. Thank you. Maybe you want to give your last comments so that we'll just wrap it up. Maybe your last comments.
Myself?
Yes, Philip. Yes.
Yeah. Look, I very much appreciated the conversation today. I learned a lot from both you and Ōgibwe. I really like the way Ōgibwe is framing things. Possible convergence between Canada and Africa in some areas, structural forces that are driving the evolution of Africa-China and Africa-Canada dynamics.
Yeah.
And I think we all agree there's not just a need, but an incredible opportunity that will flow from better thinking about Canada's posture in the region, how it can best partner with Africa, and as you were both saying, the time for doing that is now. And to the extent our institute can contribute to that, not necessarily as a function of our deep knowledge of Canadian foreign policy or indeed of African policy, but more about our kind of China expertise, I very much hope that we can be part of those conversations in the future as well. So thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Yes. Yes, Ōgibwe, maybe we can hear your last comment as well.
Yeah, this has been a very, very interesting conversation. I learned a lot from Professor Rowe. I think I've seen his work before, but to hear him speak today was quite satisfying. And I look forward to more and more of your work in this space. From my perspective, we do need to engage in this conversation a lot. Just like even looking at the last question about Bandung conference. Yeah, the world of today is different from that Cold War era, but there are still a lot of similarities. While in Bandung, it was about rejection of colonialism and bloc confrontation, which West versus East. Today, the conversation is rejection of imperialism and avoiding West versus East, as Nkrumah told us, neither East nor West, but forward. And forward for the African and the African country has to do with working with everybody, because all sides in this struggle for power provide certain strengths, which and Africa is at the position of accumulating strengths, right? So it needs to learn, it needs to work with all of these countries, and you really see enthusiasm coming from certain countries to pass on expertise, knowledge, and collaboration with African countries. We as scholars, researchers, writers, analysts, what have you, just need to again double the research to really provide clarity on where the complementarities are, and even advice on how to go about it. And I think that is the work that you are doing in your center, Paul, and also Professor Rowe is doing, and we at Development Reimagined we're also doing as well to ensure we really provide that policy clarity to build stronger and more win-win-win relationships.
Right. Thank you very much. We we've come to the end of a very insightful session. I think the comments, the Q&A, we get a lot of feedback, positive feedback, and that's very encouraging. So this session has been recorded. We're going to have it available on the YouTube channel, both on ACCPA YouTube channel as well as on CCAAPR's socials. So if you're following both institutions, be rest assured that you can get access to it. Yes, Philip. Yeah.
Yeah, we'll put it on our channel as
Only
well.
on the platform as well. Okay,
Yeah,
perfect. Yeah. So we'll have it sent to you as well. So you can also have it on the platform. So you can follow all of us, the China Institute at the University of Alberta. They're on LinkedIn, as well as Development Reimagine, the ACCPA and the CCAAPR. We're all available on across the social. So you can also follow us and get regular updates. A big thank you to our speakers, Professor Rowe, and of course, Ovigwe, and to our partner, the CCAAPR, Templar, and the team. Thank you all for making this a possibility, and we're very hopeful that this is just the beginning, that we will find ourselves working together again on other platforms, other projects, and hopefully we can help shape the kind of engagement that we will see more impact in the policy space across Africa, Canada, and elsewhere. So thank you very much for joining, and we really appreciate your time. Until then, say goodbye.
thank you, Paul.
Yeah.